Chapter 46 of Great Expectations, by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 8 o'clock had struck before I got into the air that was scented, not disagreeably, by the chips and shavings of the longshore boat builders and mast, oar, and block makers. All that waterside region of the upper and lower Pool below bridge was unknown ground to me, and when I struck down by the river, I found that the spot I wanted was not where I had supposed it to be, and was anything but easy to find. It was called Mill Pond Bank, Chink's Basin, and I had no other guide to Chink's Basin than the old green copper rope walk. It matters not what stranded ships repairing in dry docks I lost myself among, what old hulls of ships in course of being knocked to pieces, what ooze and slime and other dregs of tide, what yards of shipbuilders and shipbreakers, what rusty anchors blindly biting into the ground, though for years off duty, what mountainous country of accumulated casks and timber, how many rope works that were not the old green copper. After several times falling short of my destination, and as often overshooting it, I came unexpectedly round a corner upon Mill Pond Bank. It was a fresh kind of place, all circumstances considered, where the wind from the river had room to turn itself round, and there were 2 or 3 trees in it, and there was the stump of a ruined windmill, and there was the old green copper rope walk, whose long and narrow vista I could trace in the moonlight along a series of wooden frames set in the ground, that looked like superannuated haymaking rakes, which had grown old and lost most of their teeth. Selecting from the few queer houses upon Mill Pond Bank a house with a wooden front and 3 stories of bow window, not bay window, which is another thing, I looked at the plate upon the door and read there, Mrs. Whimple. That being the name I wanted, I knocked, and an elderly woman of a pleasant and thriving appearance responded. She was immediately deposed, however, by Herbert, who silently led me into the parlour and shut the door. It was an odd sensation to see his very familiar face established quite at home in that very unfamiliar room and region, and I found myself looking at him, much as I looked at the corner cupboard with the glass and china, the shelves upon the chimney-piece, and the coloured engravings on the wall, representing the death of Captain Cook, a ship launch, and His Majesty King George III in a state coachman's wig, leather breeches, and top boots, on the terrace at Windsor. "All is well, Handel," said Herbert, "and he's quite satisfied, though eager to see you. My dear girl is with her father, and if you'll wait till she comes down, I'll make you known to her, and then we'll go upstairs." "That's her father." I had become aware of an alarming growling overhead, and had probably expressed the fact in my countenance. "I'm afraid he's a sad old rascal," said Herbert, smiling, "but I have never seen him. Don't you smell rum? He's always at it." "At rum?" said I. "Yes," returned Herbert, "and you may suppose how mild it makes his gout. He persists, too, in keeping all the provisions upstairs in his room, and serving them out. He keeps them on shelves over his head, and will weigh them all. His room must be like a chandler's shop." While he thus spoke, the growling noise became a prolonged roar, and then died away. "What else can be the consequence," said Herbert in explanation, "if he will cut the cheese? A man with the gout in his right hand, and everywhere else, can't expect to get through a double Gloucester without hurting himself." He seemed to have hurt himself very much, for he gave another furious roar. "To have Provis for an upper lodger is quite a godsend to Mrs. Whimple," said Herbert, "for of course people in general won't stand that noise. Curious place, Handel, isn't it?" It was a curious place indeed, but remarkably well kept and clean. "Mrs. Whimple," said Herbert, when I told him so, "is the best of housewives, and I really do not know what my Clara would do without her motherly help. For Clara has no mother of her own, Handel, and no relation in the world but old Gruff and Grim." "Surely that's not his name, Herbert?" "No, no," said Herbert, "that's my name for him. His name is Mr. Barley. But what a blessing it is for the son of my father and mother to love a girl who has no relations, and who can never bother herself or anybody else about her family." Herbert had told me on former occasions, and now reminded me, that he first knew Miss Clara Barley when she was completing her education at an establishment in Hammersmith, and that on her being recalled home to nurse her father, he and she had confided their afternoon to the motherly Mrs. Whimple, by whom it had been fostered and regulated with equal kindness and discretion ever since. It was understood that nothing of a tender nature could possibly be confided to old Barley, by reason of his being totally unequal to the consideration of any subject more psychological than gout, rum, and purser's stores. As we were thus conversing in a low tone, while old Barley's sustained growl vibrated in the beam that crossed the ceiling, the room door opened, and a very pretty, slight, dark-eyed girl of 20 or so came in with a basket in her hand, whom Herbert tenderly relieved of the basket, and presented, blushing, as Clara. She really was a most charming girl, and might have passed for a captive fairy, whom that truculent ogre, old Barley, had pressed into his service. "Look here," said Herbert, showing me the basket with a compassionate and tender smile, after we had talked a little. "Here's poor Clara's supper, served out every night. Here's her allowance of bread, and here's her slice of cheese, and here's her rum, which I drink. This is Mr. Barley's breakfast for to-morrow, served out to be cooked. 2 mutton chops, 3 potatoes, some split peas, a little flour, 2 ounces of butter, a pinch of salt, and all this black pepper. It's stewed up together and taken hot, and it's a nice thing for the gout, I should think." There was something so natural and winning in Clara's resigned way of looking at these stores in detail as Herbert pointed them out, and something so confiding, loving, and innocent in her modest manner of yielding herself to Herbert's embracing arm, and something so gentle in her, so much needing protection on Mill Pond Bank, by Chink's Basin and the old green copper rope walk, with old Barley growling in the beam, that I would not have undone the engagement between her and Herbert for all the money in the pocket book I had never opened. I was looking at her with pleasure and admiration, when suddenly the growl swelled into a roar again, and a frightful bumping noise was heard above, as if a giant with a wooden leg were trying to bore it through the ceiling to come at us. Upon this Clara said to Herbert, "Papa wants me, darling," and ran away. "There's an unconscionable old shark for you," said Herbert. "What do you suppose he wants now, Handel?" "I don't know," said I. "Something to drink?" "That's it," cried Herbert, as if he had made a guess of extraordinary merit. "He keeps his grog ready mixed in a little tub on the table. Wait a moment, and you'll hear Clara lift him up to take some. There he goes." Another roar, with a prolonged shake at the end. "Now," said Herbert, as it was succeeded by silence, "he's drinking." "Now," said Herbert, as the growl resounded in the beam once more, "he's down again on his back." Clara returned soon afterwards, and Herbert accompanied me upstairs to see our charge. As we passed Mr. Barley's door, he was heard hoarsely muttering within, in a strain that rose and fell like the wind, the following refrain, in which I substitute good wishes for something quite the reverse: "Ahoy, bless your eyes, here's old Bill Barley, here's old Bill Barley, bless your eyes. Here's old Bill Barley on the flat of his back, by Lord, lying on the flat of his back, like a drifting old dead flounder. Here's your old Bill Barley, bless your eyes. Ahoy, bless you." At this strain of consolation, Herbert informed me the invisible Barley would commune with himself by the day and night together, often while it was light, having at the same time one eye at a telescope which was fitted on his bed for the convenience of sweeping the river. In his 2 cabin rooms at the top of the house, which were fresh and airy, and in which Mr. Barley was less audible than below, I found Provis comfortably settled. He expressed no alarm, and seemed to feel none that was worth mentioning, but it struck me that he was softened indefinably, for I could not have said how, and could never afterwards recall how when I tried, but certainly. The opportunity that the day's rest had given me for reflection had resulted in my fully determining to say nothing to him respecting Compeyson. For anything I knew, his animosity towards the man might otherwise lead to his seeking him out and rushing on his own destruction. Therefore, when Herbert and I sat down with him by his fire, I asked him first of all whether he relied on Wemmick's judgment and sources of information. "Ay, dear boy," he answered with a grave nod. "Jaggers knows." "Then I have talked with Mr. Wemmick," said I, "and I have come to tell you what caution he gave me and what advice." This I did accurately, with the reservation just mentioned, and I told him how Wemmick had heard in Newgate Prison, whether from officers or prisoners I could not say, that he was under some suspicion, and that my chambers had been watched. How Wemmick had recommended his keeping close for a time, and my keeping away from him, and what Wemmick had said about getting him abroad. I added, that of course when the time came I should go with him, or I should follow close upon him, as I might be safest in Wemmick's judgment. What was to follow, that I did not touch upon. Neither indeed was I at all clear or comfortable about it in my own mind, now that I saw him in that softer condition, and in declared peril for my sake. As to altering my way of living by enlarging my expenses, I put it to him whether in our present unsettled and difficult circumstances would it not be simply ridiculous if it were no worse. He could not deny this, and indeed was very reasonable throughout. His coming back was a venture, he said, and he had always known it to be a venture. He would do nothing to make it a desperate venture, and he had very little fear of his safety with such good help. Herbert, who had been looking at the fire and pondering, here said that something had come into his thoughts arising out of Wemmick's suggestion, which might be worth while to pursue. "We are both good watermen, Handel, and could take him down the river ourselves when the right time comes. No boat would then be hired for the purpose, and no boatman. That would save at least a chance of suspicion, and any chance is worth saving. Never mind the season. Don't you think it might be a good thing if you began at once to keep a boat at the Temple Stairs, and were in the habit of rowing up and down the river? You fall into that habit, and then who notices or minds? Do it 20 or 50 times, and there's nothing special in your doing it, the 21st or 51st. I liked this scheme, and Provis was quite elated by it. We agreed that it should be carried into execution, and that Provis should never recognise us if we came below bridge and rowed past Mill Pond Bank. But we further agreed that he should pull down the blind in that part of his window which gave upon the east whenever he saw us and was all right. Our conference now being ended and everything arranged, I rose to go, remarking to Herbert that he and I had better not go home together, and that I would take half an hour's start of him. "I don't like to leave you here," I said to Provis, "though I cannot doubt your being safer here than near me. Good-bye." "Dear boy," he answered, clasping my hands, "I don't know when we might meet again, and I don't like good-bye. Say good night." "Good night, Herbert." "Good night. Herbert will go regularly between us, and when the time comes you may be certain I shall be ready. Good night, good night." We thought it best that he should stay in his own rooms, and we left him on the landing outside his door, holding a light over the stair rail to light us downstairs. Looking back at him, I thought of the first night of his return, when our positions were reversed, and when I little supposed my heart could ever be as heavy and anxious parting from him as it was now. Old Barley was growling and swearing when we repassed his door, with no appearance of having ceased or meaning to cease. When we got to the foot of the stairs, I asked Herbert whether he had preserved the name of Provis. He replied, certainly not, and that the lodger was Mr. Campbell. He also explained that the utmost known of Mr. Campbell there was, that he, Herbert, had Mr. Campbell consigned to him, and felt a strong personal interest in his well being cared for, and living a secluded life. So when we went into the parlour where Mrs. Wimple and Clara were seated at work, I said nothing of my own interest in Mr. Campbell, but kept it to myself. When I had taken leave of the pretty, gentle, dark-eyed girl, and of the motherly woman who had not outlived her honest sympathy with a little affair of true love, I felt as if the old green copper rope walk had grown quite a different place. Old Barley might be as old as the hills, and might swear like a whole field of troopers, but there were redeeming youth and trust and hope enough in Chink's basin to fill it to overflowing. And then I thought of Estella and of our parting, and went home very sadly. All things were as quiet in the Temple as ever I had seen them. The windows of the rooms on that side lately occupied by Provis were dark and still, and there was no lounger in garden court. I walked past the fountain twice or thrice before I descended the steps that were between me and my rooms, but I was quite alone. Herbert, coming to my bedside when he came in, for I went straight to bed, dispirited and fatigued, made the same report. Opening one of the windows after that, he looked out into the moonlight and told me that the pavement was as solemnly empty as the pavement of any cathedral at the same hour. Next day I set myself to get the boat, and was soon done. The boat was brought round to the Temple stairs, and lay where I could reach her within a minute or two. Then I began to go out as for training and practice, sometimes alone, sometimes with Herbert. I was often out in cold, rain, and sleet, but nobody took much note of me after I had been out a few times. At first I kept above Blackfriars Bridge, but as the hours of the tide changed, I took towards London Bridge. It was old London Bridge in those days, and at certain states of the tide there was a race and fall of water there which gave it a bad reputation. But I knew well enough how to shoot the bridge after seeing it done, and so began to row about among the shipping in the Pool and down to Erith. The first time I passed Millbank Pond, Herbert and I were pulling a pair of oars, and both in going and returning we saw the blind towards the east come down. Herbert was rarely there less frequently than 3 times a week, and he never brought me a single word of intelligence that was at all alarming. Still, I knew that there was cause for alarm, and I could not get rid of the notion of being watched. Once received, it is a haunting idea. How many undesigning persons I suspected of watching me, it would be hard to calculate. In short, I was always full of fears for the rash man who was hiding. Herbert had sometimes said to me that he found it pleasant to stand at one of our windows after dark, when the tide was running down, and to think that it was flowing with everything it bore towards Clara. But I thought with dread that it was flowing towards Magwitch, and that any black mark on its surface might be his pursuers going swiftly, silently, and surely to take him. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of Great Expectations, by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Some weeks passed without bringing any change. We waited for Wemmick, and he made no sign. If I had never known him out of Little Britain, and had never enjoyed the privilege of being on a familiar footing at the castle, I might have doubted him. Not so for a moment, knowing him as I did. My worldly affairs began to wear a gloomy appearance, and I was pressed for money by more than one creditor. Even I myself began to know the want of money, I mean of ready money in my own pocket, and to relieve it by converting some easily spared articles of jewellery into cash. But I had quite determined it would be heartless fraud to take more money from my patron in the existing state of my uncertain thoughts and plans. Therefore I had sent him the unopened pocket book by Herbert to hold in his own keeping, and I felt a kind of satisfaction, whether it was a false kind or a true I hardly know, in not having profited by his generosity since his revelation of himself. As the time wore on, an impression settled heavily upon me that Estella was married. Fearful of having it confirmed, though it was all but a conviction, I avoided the newspapers, and begged Herbert, to whom I had confided the circumstances of our last interview, never to speak of her to me. Why I hoarded up this last wretched little rag of the robe of hope that was rent and given to the winds, how do I know? Why did you, who read this, commit that not dissimilar inconsistency of your own last year, last month, last week? It was an unhappy life that I lived, and its one dominant anxiety, towering over all its other anxieties, like a high mountain above a range of mountains, never disappeared from my view. Still, no new cause for fear arose. Let me start from my bed as I would with a terror fresh upon me that he was discovered. Let me sit listening as I would with dread for Herbert's returning step at night, lest it should be fleeter than ordinary and winged with evil news. For all that, and much more to like purpose, the round of things went on. Condemned to inaction and a state of constant restlessness and suspense, I rowed about in my boat, and waited, as best I could. There were states of the tide when, having been down the river, I could not get back through the eddy-chafed arches and starlings of old London Bridge. Then I left my boat at a wharf near the Custom House, to be brought up afterwards to the Temple Stairs. I was not averse to doing this, as it served to make me and my boat a commoner incident among the waterside people there. From this slight occasion sprang two meetings that I now have to tell of. One afternoon, late in the month of February, I came ashore at the wharf at dusk. I had pulled down as far as Greenwich with the ebb tide, and had turned with the tide. It had been a fine bright day, but had become foggy as the sun dropped, and I had to feel my way back among the shipping pretty carefully. Both in going and returning I had seen the signal at his window, "All well." As it was a raw evening and I was cold, I thought I would comfort myself with dinner at once, and as I had the hours of dejection and solitude before me if I went home to the Temple, I thought I would afterwards go to the play. The theatre where Mr. Wopsle had achieved his questionable triumph was in that waterside neighbourhood. It is nowhere now, and to that theatre I resolved to go. I was aware that Mr. Wopsle had not succeeded in reviving the drama, but, on the contrary, had rather partaken of its decline. He had been ominously heard of through the playbills as a faithful black in connection with a little girl of noble birth and a monkey, and Herbert had seen him as a predatory Tartar of comic propensities, with a face like a red brick and an outrageous hat all over bells. I dined at what Herbert and I used to call a geographical chop-house, where there were maps of the world in porter-pot rims on every half-yard of the tablecloths, and charts of gravy on every one of the knives. To this day there is scarcely a single chop-house within the Lord Mayor's dominions which is not geographical, and wore out the time dozing over crumbs, staring at gas, and baking in a hot blast of dinners. By and by I roused myself and went to the play. There I found a virtuous boatswain in His Majesty's service, a most excellent man, though I could have wished his trousers were not quite so tight in some places, and not quite so loose in others, who knocked off all the little men's hats over their eyes, though he was very generous and brave, and who wouldn't hear of anybody's paying taxes, though he was very patriotic. He had a bag of money in his pocket like a pudding in a cloth, and on that property married a young person, in bed furniture, with great rejoicings. The whole population of Portsmouth, 9 in number at the last census, turning out on the beach to rub their own hands and shake everybody else's, and sing "Fill, fill." A certain dark-complexioned swab, however, who wouldn't fill, or do anything else that was proposed to him, and whose heart was openly stated by the boatswain to be as black as his figurehead, proposed to 2 other swabs to get all mankind into difficulties, which was so effectually done, the swab family having considerable political influence, that it took half the evening to set things right, and then it was only brought about through an honest little grocer, with a white hat, black gaiters, and a red nose, getting into a clock with a gridiron, and listening and coming out, and knocking everybody down from behind with the gridiron whom he couldn't confute with what he had overheard. This led to Mr. Wopsle's, who had never been heard of before, coming in with a star and garter on, as a plenipotentiary of a great power direct from the Admiralty, to say that the swabs were all to go to prison on the spot, and that he had brought the boatswain down the Union Jack as a slight acknowledgment of his public services. The boatswain, unmanned for the first time, respectfully dried his eyes on the Jack, then cheering up and addressing Mr. Wopsle as "Your Honour," solicited permission to take him by the fin. Mr. Wopsle, conceding his fin with a gracious dignity, was immediately shoved into a dusty corner, while everybody danced a hornpipe, and from that corner, surveying the public with a discontented eye, became aware of me. The second piece was the last new grand comic Christmas pantomime, in the first scene of which it pained me to suspect that I detected Mr. Wopsle with red worsted legs under a highly magnified phosphoric countenance and a shock of red curtain fringe for his hair, engaged in the manufacture of thunderbolts in a mine, and displaying great cowardice when his gigantic master came home, very hoarse, to dinner. But he presently presented himself under worthier circumstances, for, the genius of youthful love being in want of assistance, on account of the parental brutality of an ignorant farmer who opposed the choice of his daughter's heart by purposely falling upon the object in a flour sack out of the first floor window, summoned a sensuous enchanter, and he, coming up from the antipodes rather unsteadily after an apparently violent journey, proved to be Mr. Wopsle in a high-crowned hat, with a necromantic work in one volume under his arm. The business of this enchanter on earth being principally to be talked at, sung at, butted at, danced at, and flashed at with fires of various colours, he had a good deal of time on his hands, and I observed with great surprise that he devoted it to staring in my direction as if he were lost in amazement. There was something so remarkable in the increasing glare of Mr. Wopsle's eye, and he seemed to be turning so many things over in his mind, and to grow so confused, that I could not make it out. I sat thinking of it long after he had ascended to the clouds in a large watch case, and still I could not make it out. I was still thinking of it when I came out of the theatre an hour afterwards, and found him waiting for me near the door. "How do you do?" said I, shaking hands with him as we turned down the street together. "I saw that you saw me." "Saw you, Mr. Pip?" he returned. "Yes, of course I saw you. But who else was there?" "Who else? It's the strangest thing," said Mr. Wopsle, drifting into his lost look again, "and yet I could swear to him." Becoming alarmed, I entreated Mr. Wopsle to explain his meaning. "Whether I should have noticed him at first, but for your being there," said Mr. Wopsle, going on in the same lost way, "I can't be positive, yet I think I should." Involuntarily I looked around me, as I was accustomed to look around me when I went home, for these mysterious words gave me a chill. "Oh, he can't be in sight," said Mr. Wopsle. "He went out before I went off. I saw him go." Having the reason that I had for being suspicious, I even suspected this poor actor. I mistrusted a design to entrap me into some admission. Therefore I glanced at him as we walked together, but said nothing. I had a ridiculous fancy that he must be with you, Mr. Pip, till I saw that you were quite unconscious of him sitting behind you there like a ghost. My former chill crept over me again, but I was resolved not to speak, for it was quite consistent with his words that he might be set on to induce me to connect these references with Provis. Of course I was perfectly sure and safe that Provis had not been there. "I dare say you wonder at me, Mr. Pip. Indeed, I see you do. But it is so very strange. You'll hardly believe what I'm going to tell you. I could hardly believe it myself, if you told me." "Indeed," said I. "No, indeed, Mr. Pip. You remember in old times a certain Christmas day, when you were quite a child, and I dined at Gargery's, and some soldiers came to the door to get a pair of handcuffs mended?" "I remember it very well." "And you remember that there was a chase after two convicts, and that we joined in it, and that Gargery took you on his back, and that I took the lead, and you kept up with me as well as you could?" "I remember it all very well, better than he thought, except the last clause. And you remember that we came up with the two in a ditch, and there was a scuffle between them, and one of them had been severely handled and much mauled about the face by the other. I see it all before me, and that the soldiers lighted torches and put the two in the centre, and we went on to see the last of them over the black marshes, with the torchlight shining on their faces. I am particular about that, with the torchlight shining on their faces, when there was an outer ring of dark night all about us." "Yes," said I remember all that." "Then, Mr. Pip, one of those two prisoners sat behind you tonight. I saw him over your shoulder." Steady, I thought. I asked him then, "Which of the two do you suppose you saw?" "The one who had been mauled," he answered readily. "And I'll swear I saw him. The more I think of him, the more certain I am of him." "This is very curious," said I, with the best assumption I could put on its being nothing more to me. "Very curious indeed." I cannot exaggerate the enhanced disquiet into which this conversation threw me, or the special and peculiar terror I felt at Compeyson's having been behind me, like a ghost. For if he had ever been out of my thoughts for a few moments together since the hiding had begun, it was in those very moments when he was closest to me, and to think that I should be so unconscious and off my guard, after all my care, was as if I had shut an avenue of 100 doors to keep him out, and then had found him at my elbow. I could not doubt either that he was there because I was there, and that however slight an appearance of danger there might be about us, danger was always near and active. I put such questions to Mr. Wopsle as, "When did the man come in?" He could not tell me that. He saw me, and over my shoulder he saw the man. It was not until he had seen him for some time that he began to identify him, but he had from the first vaguely associated him with me, and known him as somehow belonging to me in the old village time. How was he dressed? Prosperously, but not noticeably otherwise. He thought in black. Was his face at all disfigured? No, he believed not. I believed not too, for although in my brooding state I had taken no especial notice of the people behind me, I thought it likely that a face at all disfigured would have attracted my attention. When Mr. Wopsle had imparted to me all that he could recall, or I extract, and when I had treated him to a little appropriate refreshment, after the fatigues of the evening, we parted. It was between 12 and 1 o'clock when I reached the Temple, and the gates were shut. No one was near me when I went in and went home. Herbert had come in, and we held a very serious council by the fire, but there was nothing to be done, saving to communicate to Wemmick what I had that night found out, and to remind him that we waited for his hint. As I thought that I might compromise him if I went too often to the castle, I made this communication by letter. I wrote it before I went to bed, and went out and posted it, and again no one was near me. Herbert and I agreed that we could do nothing else but be very cautious, and we were very cautious indeed, more cautious than before, if that were possible, and I for my part never went near Chink's Basin except when I rode by, and then only looked at Mill Pond Bank as I looked at anything else. End of chapter 47. Chapter 48 of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The second of the two meetings referred to in the last chapter occurred about a week after the first. I had again left my boat at the wharf below bridge. The time was an hour earlier in the afternoon, and undecided where to dine, I had strolled up into Cheapside, and was strolling along it, surely the most unsettled person in all the busy concourse, when a large hand was laid upon my shoulder by some one overtaking me. It was Mr. Jaggers's hand, and he passed it through my arm. "Are we going in the same direction, Pip? May we walk together? Where are you bound for?" "For the Temple, I think," said I. "Don't you know?" said Mr. Jaggers. "Well," I returned, glad for once to get the better of him in cross-examination, "I do not know, for I have not made up my mind." "You're going to dine," said Mr. Jaggers. "You don't mind admitting that, I suppose?" "No," I returned, "I don't mind admitting that." "And are you not engaged?" "I don't mind admitting also that I am not engaged." "Then," said Mr. Jaggers, "come dine with me." I was going to excuse myself, when he added, "Wemmick's coming." So I changed my excuse into an acceptance, the few words I had uttered serving for the beginning of either. And we went along Cheapside and slanted off to Little Britain, while the lights were springing up brilliantly in the shop windows, and the street lamplighters, scarcely finding ground enough to plant their ladders on in the midst of the afternoon bustle, were skipping up and down and running in and out, opening more red eyes in the gathering fog than my rushlight tower at the Hum-Hums had opened white eyes in the ghostly wall. At the office in Little Britain there was the usual letter writing, hand washing, candle snuffing, and safe locking that closed the business of the day. As I stood idle by Mr. Jaggers's fire, its rising and falling flame made the two casts on the shelf look as if they were playing a diabolical game at Bo Peep with me, while the pair of coarse, fat office candles that dimly lighted Mr. Jaggers as he wrote in a corner were decorated with dirty winding sheets, as if in remembrance of a ghost of hanged clients. We went to Gerrard Street, all three together, in a hackney coach, and as soon as we got there dinner was served. Although I should not have thought of making in that place the most distant reference by so much as a look to Wemmick's Walworth sentiments, yet I should have no objection to catching his eye now and then in a friendly way. But it was not to be done. He turned his eyes on Mr. Jaggers whenever he raised them from the table, and was as dry and distant to me as if there were twin Wemmicks, and this was the wrong one. "Did you send that note of Miss Havisham's to Mr. Pip, Wemmick?" Mr. Jaggers asked, soon after we began dinner. "No, sir," returned Wemmick. "It was going by post when you brought Mr. Pip into the office. Here it is." He handed it to his principal instead of to me. "It's a note of 2 lines, Pip," said Mr. Jaggers, handing it on. "Sent up to me by Miss Havisham on account of her not being sure of your address. She tells me that she wants to see you on a little matter of business you mentioned to her. You'll go down?" "Yes," said I, casting my eyes over the note, which was exactly in those terms. "When do you think of going down?" "I have an impending engagement," said I, glancing at Wemmick, who was putting fish into the post office, "that renders me rather uncertain of my time. At once, I think." "If Mr. Pip has the intention of going at once," said Wemmick to Mr. Jaggers, "he needn't write an answer, you know." Receiving this as an intimation that it was best not to delay, I settled that I would go to morrow, and said so. Wemmick drank a glass of wine, and looked with a grimly satisfied air at Mr. Jaggers, but not at me. "So, Pip, our friend the Spider," said Mr. Jaggers, "has played all his cards. He has won the pool." It was as much as I could do to assent. He's a promising fellow in his way, but he may not have it all his own way. The stronger will win in the end, but the stronger has to be found out first. If he should turn to and beat her—" "Surely," I interrupted, with a burning face and heart, "you do not seriously think that he is scoundrel enough for that, Mr. Jaggers?" "I didn't say so, Pip. I am putting a case. If he should turn to and beat her, he may possibly get strength on his side. If it should be a question of intellect, he certainly will not. It would be chance work to give an opinion of how a fellow of that sort will turn out in such circumstances, because it's a toss-up between 2 results." "May I ask what they are?" "A fellow like our friend the Spider," answered Mr. Jaggers, "either beats or cringes. He may cringe and growl, or cringe and not growl, but he either beats or cringes. Ask Wemmick his opinion." "Either beats or cringes," said Wemmick, not at all addressing himself to me. "So here's to Mrs. Bentley Drummle," said Mr. Jaggers, taking a decanter of choicer wine from his dumb waiter, and filling for each of us and for himself. "And may the question of supremacy be settled to the lady's satisfaction, to the satisfaction of the lady and gentleman. It will never be. Now, Molly, 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 how slow you are to-day." She was at his elbow when he addressed her, putting a dish upon the table. As she withdrew her hands from it, she fell back a step or 2, nervously muttering some excuse, and a certain action of her fingers as she spoke arrested my attention. "What's the matter?" said Mr. Jaggers. "Nothing. Only the subject we were speaking of," said I, "was rather painful to me." The action of her fingers was like the action of knitting. She stood looking at her master, not understanding whether she was free to go, or whether he had more to say to her, and would call her back if she did go. Her look was very intent. Surely I had seen exactly such eyes and such hands on a memorable occasion very lately. He dismissed her, and she glided out of the room, but she remained before me as plainly as if she were still there. I looked at those hands, I looked at those eyes, I looked at that flowing hair, and I compared them with other hands, other eyes, other hair that I knew of, and with what those might be after 20 years of a brutal husband and a stormy life. I looked again at those hands and eyes of the housekeeper, and thought of the inexplicable feeling that had come over me when I last walked, not alone, in the ruined garden and through the deserted brewery. I thought how the same feeling had come back when I saw a face looking at me, and a hand waving to me from the stage-coach window, and how it had come back again and had flashed about me like lightning when I had passed it in a carriage, not alone, through a sudden glare of light in a dark street. I thought how one link of association had helped that identification in the theatre, and how such a link, wanting before, had been riveted for me now, when I had passed by a chance swift from Estella's name to the fingers with their knitting action and the attentive eyes, and I felt absolutely certain that this woman was Estella's mother. Mr. Jaggers had seen me with Estella, and was not likely to have missed the sentiments I had been at no pains to conceal. He nodded when I said the subject was painful to me, clapped me on the back, put round the wine again, and went on with his dinner. Only twice more did the housekeeper reappear, and then her stay in the room was very short, and Mr. Jaggers was sharp with her. But her hands were Estella's hands, and her eyes were Estella's eyes, and if she had reappeared 100 times, I could have been neither more sure nor less sure that my conviction was the truth. It was a dull evening, for Wemmick drew his wine when it came round, quite as a matter of business, just as he might have drawn his salary when that came round, and with his eyes on his chief sat in a state of perpetual readiness for cross-examination. As to the quantity of wine, his post office was as indifferent and ready as any other post office for its quantity of letters. From my point of view, he was the wrong twin all the time, and only externally like the Wemmick of Walworth. We took our leave early and left together. Even when we were groping among Mr. Jaggers' stock of boots for our hats, I felt that the right twin was on his way back, and we had not gone half a dozen yards down Gerrard Street in the Walworth direction before I found out that I was walking arm in arm with the right twin, and that the wrong twin had evaporated into the evening air. "Well," said Wemmick, "that's over. He's a wonderful man without his living likeness, but I feel that I have to screw myself up when I dine with him, and I dine more comfortably unscrewed." I felt that this was a good statement of the case, and told him so. "Wouldn't say it to anybody but yourself," he answered. "I know that what it is said between you and me goes no further." I asked him if he had ever seen Miss Havisham's adopted daughter, Mrs. Bentley Drummle. He said no. To avoid being too abrupt, I then spoke of the aged and of Miss Skiffkins. He looked rather sly when I mentioned Miss Skiffkins, and stopped in the street to blow his nose, with a roll of the head and a flourish not quite free from latent boastfulness. "Wemmick," said I, "do you remember telling me, before I first went to Mr. Jaggers' private house, to notice that housekeeper?" "Did I?" he replied. "Ah, I dare say I did. Deuce take me," he added suddenly, "I know I did. I find I am not quite unscrewed yet. A wild beast tamed, you called her. And what do you call her?" "The same. How did Mr. Jaggers tame her, Wemmick?" "That's his secret. She has been with him many a long year. I wish you would tell me her story. I feel a particular interest in being acquainted with it. You know that what is said between you and me goes no further." "Well," Wemmick replied, "I don't know her story, that is, I don't know all of it. But what I do know I'll tell you. We are in our private and personal capacities, of course." "Of course." "A score or so years ago that woman was tried at the Old Bailey for murder, and was acquitted. She was a very handsome young woman, and I believe had some gipsy blood in her. Anyway, it was hot enough when it was up, as you may suppose. But she was acquitted. Mr. Jaggers was for her," pursued Wemmick with a look full of meaning, "and worked the case in a way quite astonishing. It was a desperate case, and it was comparatively early days with him then, and he worked it to general admiration. In fact, it may almost be said to have made him. He worked it himself at the police office, day after day, for many days, contending against even a committal, and at the trial, where he couldn't work it himself, sat under counsel, and every one knew put in all the salt and pepper. The murdered person was a woman a good 10 years older, very much larger and very much stronger. It was a case of jealousy. They both led tramping lives, and this woman in Gerrard Street here had been married very young, over the broomstick, as we say, to a tramping man, and was a perfect fury in point of jealousy. The murdered woman, more a match for the man, certainly in point of years, was found dead in a barn near Hounslow Heath. There had been a violent struggle, perhaps a fight. She was bruised and scratched and torn, and had been held by the throat at last and choked. Now there was no reasonable evidence to implicate any person but this woman, and on the improbabilities of her having been able to do it, Mr. Jaggers principally rested his case. You may be sure," said Wemmick, touching me on the sleeve, "that he never dwelt upon the strength of her hands then, although he sometimes does now." I had told Wemmick of his showing us her wrist that day of the dinner party. "Well, sir," Wemmick went on, "it happened, don't you see, that this woman was so very artfully dressed from the time of her apprehension, that she looked much slighter than she really was. In particular, her sleeves are always remembered to have been so skilfully contrived that her arms had quite a delicate look. She only had a bruise or two about her, nothing for a tramp, but the backs of her hands were lacerated, and the question was it with fingernails? Now Mr. Jaggers showed that she had struggled through a great lot of brambles, which were not as high as her face, but which she could not have got through and kept her hands out of, and bits of those brambles were actually found in her skin and put in evidence, as well as the fact that the brambles in question were found on examination to have been broken through, and to have little shreds of her dress and little spots of blood upon them here and there. But the boldest point he made was this: it was attempted to be set up in proof of her jealousy that she was under strong suspicion of having, at about the time of the murder, frantically destroyed her child by this man, some 3 years old, to revenge herself upon him. Mr. Jaggers worked that in this way: we say these are not the marks of fingernails but the marks of brambles, and we show you the brambles. You say they are the marks of fingernails, and you set up the hypothesis that she destroyed her child. You must accept all the consequences of that hypothesis. For anything we know, she may have destroyed her child, and the child in clinging to her may have scratched her hands. What then? You are not trying her for the murder of her child. Why don't you? As to this case, if you will have scratches, we say that for anything we know, you may have accounted for them, assuming for the sake of argument that you have not invented them. To sum up, sir, said Wemmick, Mr. Jaggers was altogether too many for the jury, and they gave in. Has she been in his service ever since? Yes, but not only that, said Wemmick. She went into his service immediately after her acquittal, tamed as she is now. She has since been taught one thing and another in the way of her duties, but she was tamed from the beginning. Do you remember the sex of the child? Said to have been a girl. You have nothing more to say to me tonight? Nothing. I got your letter and destroyed it. Nothing. We exchanged a cordial good night, and I went home, with a new matter for my thoughts, though with no relief from the old. End of chapter 48. Of Great Expectations, by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Putting Miss Havisham's note in my pocket, that it might serve as my credentials for so soon reappearing at Satis House, in case her waywardness should lead her to express any surprise at seeing me, I went down again by the coach next day. But I alighted at the halfway house, and breakfasted there, and walked the rest of the distance, for I sought to get into town quietly by the unfrequented ways, and to leave it in the same manner. The best light of the day was gone when I passed along the quiet echoing courts behind the High Street. The nooks of ruin, where the old monks had once had their refectories and gardens, and where the strong walls were now pressed into the service of humble sheds and stables, were almost as silent as the old monks in their graves. The cathedral chimes had at once a sadder and more remote sound to me, as I hurried on avoiding observation, than they ever had before, so the swell of the old organ was borne to my ears like funeral music, and the rooks, as they hovered about the grey tower and swung in the bare high trees of the priory garden, seemed to call to me that the place was changed, and that Estella was gone out of it for ever. An elderly woman, who I had seen before as one of the servants who lived in the supplementary house across the back of the courtyard, opened the gate. The lighted candle stood in the dark passage within, as of old, and I took it up, and ascended the staircase alone. Miss Havisham was not in her own room, but was in the larger room across the landing. Looking in at the door, after knocking in vain, I saw her sitting on the hearth in a ragged chair, close before and lost in the contemplation of the ashy fire. Doing as I had often done, I went in, and stood touching the old chimney-piece, where she could see me when she raised her eyes. There was an air of utter loneliness upon her, that would have moved me to pity, though she had wilfully done me a deeper injury than I could charge her with. As I stood compassionating her, and thinking how, in the progress of time, I too had come to be part of the wrecked fortunes of that house, her eyes rested on me, She stared and said in a low voice, "Is it real?" "It is I, Pip. Mr. Jaggers gave me your note yesterday, and I have lost no time. Thank you, thank you." As I brought another of the ragged chairs to the hearth and sat down, I remarked a new expression on her face, as if she were afraid of me. "I want," she said, "to pursue that subject you mentioned to me when you were last here, and to show you that I am not all stone. But perhaps you can never believe now that there is anything human in my heart." When I said some reassuring words, she stretched out her tremulous right hand, as though she was going to touch me, but she recalled it again before I understood the action or knew how to receive it. "You said, speaking for your friend, that you could tell me how to do something useful and good, something that you would like done, is it not?" "Something that I would like done very much." "What is it?" I began explaining to her that secret history of the partnership. I had not got far into it when I judged from her looks that she was thinking in a discursive way of me rather than what I said. It seemed to be so, for when I stopped speaking, many moments passed before she showed that she was conscious of the fact. "Do you break off?" she asked then, with her former air of being afraid of me, "because you hate me too much to bear to speak to me?" "No, no," I answered. "How can you think so, Miss Havisham? I stopped because I thought you were not following what I said." "Perhaps I was not," she answered, putting her hand to her head. "Begin again, and let me look at something else. Stay, now tell me." She set her hand upon her stick in the resolute way that sometimes was habitual to her, and looked at the fire with a strong expression of forcing herself to attend. I went on with my explanation, and told her how I had hoped to complete the transaction out of my means, but how in this I was disappointed. That part of the subject, I reminded her, involved matters which could form no part of my explanation, for they were the weighty secrets of another. "So," said she, assenting with her head, but not looking at me, "and how much money is wanting to complete the purchase?" I was rather afraid of stating it, for it sounded a large sum. £900. "If I give you the money for this purpose, will you keep it my secret as you have kept your own?" "Quite as faithfully." "And your mind will be more at rest?" "Much more at rest." "Are you very unhappy now?" She asked this question still without looking at me, but in an unwonted tone of sympathy. I could not reply at the moment, for my voice failed me. She put her left arm across the head of her stick, and softly laid her forehead on it. "I am far from happy, Miss Havisham, but I have other causes of disquiet than any you know of. They are the secrets I have mentioned." After a while she raised her head and looked at the fire again. "It is noble in you to tell me that you have other causes of unhappiness. Is it true?" "Too true." "Can I only serve you, Pip, by serving your friend? Regarding that as done, is there nothing I can do for you yourself?" "Nothing. I thank you for the question. I thank you even more for the tone of the question. But there is nothing." She presently rose from her seat, and looked about the blighted room for the means of writing. There were none there, and she took from her pocket a yellow set of ivory tablets, mounted in tarnished gold, and wrote upon them with a pencil in a case of tarnished gold that hung from her neck. "You are still on friendly terms with Mr. Jaggers?" "Quite. I dined with him yesterday." "This is an authority to him to pay you that money, to lay out at your irresponsible discretion for your friend. I keep no money here, but if you would rather Mr. Jaggers knew nothing of the matter, I will send it to you." "Thank you, Miss Havisham. I have not the least objection to receiving it from him." She read me what she had written, and it was direct and clear, and evidently intended to absolve me from any suspicion of profiting by the receipt of the money. I took the tablets from her hand, and it trembled again, and it trembled more as she took off the chain to which the pencil was attached, and put it in mine. All this she did without looking at me. "My name is on the first leaf. You can ever write under my name, I forgive her. Though ever so long after my broken heart is dust, pray do it." "Oh, Miss Havisham," said I can do it now. There have been sore mistakes, and my life has been a blind and thankless one, and I want forgiveness and direction far too much to be bitter with you." She turned her face to me for the first time since she had averted it, and to my amazement, I may even add to my terror, dropped on her knees at my feet, with her folded hands raised to me in the manner in which, when her poor heart was young and fresh and whole, they must often have been raised to heaven from her mother's side. To see her, with her white hair and her worn face, kneeling at my feet, gave me a shock through all my frame. I entreated her to rise, and got my arms about to help her up, but she only pressed that hand of mine which was nearest to her grasp, and hung her head over it and wept. I had never seen her shed a tear before, and in the hope that the relief might do her good, I bent over her without speaking. She was not kneeling now, but was down upon the ground. "Oh," she cried despairingly, "what have I done? What have I done?" "If you mean, Miss Havisham, what have you done to injure me, let me answer, very little. I should have loved her under any circumstances. Is she married?" "Yes." It was a needless question, for a new desolation in the desolate house had told me so. "What have I done? What have I done?" She wrung her hands and crushed her white hair, and returned to this cry over and over again. "What have I done?" I knew not how to answer, or how to comfort her. That she had done a grievous thing in taking an impressionable child to mould into the form that her wild resentment spurned affection, and wounded pride found vengeance in, I knew full well, but that in shutting out the light of day she had shut out infinitely more, that in seclusion she had secluded herself from 1,000 natural and healing influences, that her mind, brooding solitary, had grown diseased, as all minds do and must and will that reverse the appointed order of their Maker. I knew equally well, and I could look upon her without compassion, seeing her punishment in the ruin she was, in her profound unfitness for this earth on which she was placed, in the vanity of sorrow which had become a master mania, like the vanity of penitence, the vanity of remorse, the vanity of unworthiness, and other monstrous vanities that have been curses in this world. Until you spoke to her the other day, and until I saw you in a looking glass that showed me what I once felt myself, I did not know what I had done. What have I done? What have I done? And so again, 20, 50 times over, what had she done? "Miss Havisham," I said, when her cry had died away, "you may dismiss me from your mind and conscience, but Estella is a different case, and if you can ever undo any scrap of what you have done amiss in keeping a part of her right nature away from her, it will be better to do that than to bemoan the past through 100 years. Yes, yes, I know it, but Pip, my dear," there was an earnest womanly compassion for me in her new affection, "my dear, believe this, when she first came to me, I meant to save her from misery like my own. At first I meant no more." "Well, well," said I hope so. But as she grew and promised to be very beautiful, I gradually did worse, and with my praises, and with my jewels, and with my teachings, and with this figure of myself always before her, a warning to back and point my lessons, I stole her heart away, and put ice in its place. Better, I could not help saying, to have left her a natural heart, even to be bruised or broken. With that, Miss Havisham looked distractedly at me for a while, and then burst out again. What had she done? "If you knew all my story," she pleaded, "you would have some compassion for me, and a better understanding of me." "Miss Havisham," I answered, as delicately as I could, "I believe that I may say that I do know your story, and have known it ever since I first left this neighbourhood. It has inspired me with great commiseration, and I hope I understand it and its influences. Does what has passed between us give me any excuse for asking you a question relative to Estella? Not as she is, but as she was when she first came here." She was seated on the ground with her arms on the ragged chair, and her head leaning on them. She looked full at me when I said this, and replied, "Go on." "Whose child was Estella?" She shook her head. "You don't know?" She shook her head again. "But Mr. Jaggers brought her here, or sent her here?" "Brought her here." "Will you tell me how that came about?" She answered in a low whisper and with caution. "I have been shut up in these rooms a long time. I don't know how long. You know what time the clocks keep here. When I told him that I wanted a little girl to rear and love, and to save from my fate. I had first seen him when I sent for him to lay this place waste for me, having read of him in the newspapers, before I and the world parted. He told me that he would look about him for such an orphan child. One night he brought her here asleep, and I called her Estella." "Might I ask her age then?" 2 or 3. She herself knows nothing but that she was left an orphan, and I adopted her. So convinced I was of that woman's being her mother, that I wanted no evidence to establish the fact in my own mind, but to any mind. I thought the connection there was clear and straight. What more could I hope to do by prolonging the interview? I had succeeded on behalf of Herbert. Miss Havisham had told me all she knew of Estella. I had said and done what I could to ease her mind. No matter with what other words we parted, we parted. Twilight was closing in when I went down the stairs into the natural air. I called to the woman who had opened the gate when I entered, that I would not trouble her just yet, but would walk round the place before leaving, for I had a presentiment that I should never be there again, and I felt the dying light was suited to my last view of it. By the wilderness of the casks that I had walked on long ago, and on which the rain of years had fallen since, rotting them in many places, and leaving miniature swamps and pools of water upon those that stood on end, I made my way to the ruined garden. I went all round it, round by the corner where Herbert and I had fought our battle, round by the paths where Estella and I had walked. So cold, so lonely, so dreary all. Taking the brewery on my way back, I raised the rusty latch of a little door at the garden end of it and walked through. I was going out at the opposite door, not easy to open now, for the damp wood had started and swelled, and the hinges were yielding, and the threshold was encumbered with a growth of fungus, when I turned my head to look back. A childish association revived with wonderful force in the moment of the slight action, and I fancied that I saw Miss Havisham hanging to the beam. So strong was the impression that I stood under the beam, shuddering from head to foot before I knew it was a fancy, though to be sure I was there in an instant. The mournfulness of the place and time, and the great terror of this illusion, though it was but momentary, caused me to feel an indescribable awe as I came out between the open wooden gates where I had once wrung my hair after Estella had wrung my heart. Passing on into the front courtyard, I hesitated whether to call the woman to let me out at the locked gate of which she had the key, or first to go upstairs and assure myself that Miss Havisham was safe and well as I had left her. I took the latter course and went up. I looked into the room where I had left her, and saw her seated in the ragged chair upon the hearth close to the fire, with her back towards me. In the moment when I was withdrawing my head to go quietly away, I saw a great flaming light spring up. In the same moment I saw her running at me, shrieking, with a whirl of fire blazing all about her, and soaring at least as many feet above her head as she was high. I had a double caped greatcoat on, and over my arm another thick coat, that I got them off, closed with her, threw her down, and got them over her, that I dragged the great cloth from the table for the same purpose, and with it dragged down the heap of rottenness in the midst, and all the ugly things that sheltered there, that we were on the ground struggling like desperate enemies, and that the closer I covered her, the more wildly she shrieked and tried to free herself. That this had occurred I knew through the result, but not through anything I felt or thought or knew I did. I knew nothing until I knew that we were on the floor by the great table, and that the patches of tinder yet alight were floating in the smoky air which a moment ago had been her faded bridal dress. Then I looked round and saw the disturbed beetles and spiders running away over the floor, and the servants coming in with breathless cries at the door. I still held her forcibly down with all my strength, like a prisoner who might escape, and I doubt if I even knew who she was, or why we had struggled, or that she had been in flames, or that the flames were out, until I saw the patches of tinder that had been her garments no longer alight, but falling in a black shower around us. She was insensible, and I was afraid to have her moved, or even touched. Assistance was sent for, and I held her until it came, as if I unreasonably fancied, I think I did, that if I let her go the fire would break out again and consume her. When I got up on the surgeon's coming to her with other aid, I was astonished to see that both my hands were burnt, for I had no knowledge of it through the sense of feeling. On examination it was pronounced that she had received serious hurts, but they of themselves were far from hopeless. The danger lay mainly in the nervous shock. By the servant's directions her bed was carried into that room and laid upon the great table, which happened to be well suited to the dressing of her injuries. When I saw her again an hour afterwards, she lay indeed where I had seen her strike her stick and heard her say she would lie one day. Though every vestige of her dress was burnt, as they told me, she still had something of her old ghastly bridal appearance, for they had covered her to the throat with white cotton wool, and as she lay with a white sheet loosely overlying that, the phantom air of something that had been and was changed was still upon her. I found, on questioning the servants, that Estella was in Paris, and I got a promise from the surgeon that he would write to her by the next post. Miss Havisham's family I took upon myself, intending to communicate with Mr. Matthew Pocket only, and leave him to do as he liked about informing the rest. This I did next day, through Herbert, as soon as I returned to town. There was a stage that evening when she spoke collectedly of what had happened, though with a certain terrible vivacity. Towards midnight she began to wander in her speech, and after that it gradually set in that she said innumerable times in a low solemn voice, "What have I done?" And then, when she first came I meant to save her from misery like mine, and then, take the pencil and write under my name, "I forgive her." She never changed the order of these three sentences, but she sometimes left out a word in one or other of them, never putting in another word, but always leaving a blank and going on to the next word. As I could do no service there, and as I had nearer home that pressing reason for anxiety and fear which even her wanderings could not drive out of my mind, I decided in the course of the night that I would return by the early morning coach, walking on a mile or so, and being taken clear of the town. At about 6 o'clock of the morning, therefore, I leaned over her and touched her lips with mine, just as they said, not stopping for being touched, "Take the pencil and write under my name, I forgive her." End of chapter 49. Chapter 50 of Great Expectations, by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. My hands had been dressed twice or thrice in the night, and again in the morning. My left arm was a good deal burnt to the elbow, and less severely as high as the shoulder. It was very painful, but the flames had set in that direction, and I felt thankful it was no worse. My right hand was not so badly burnt but that I could move the fingers. It was bandaged, of course, but much less inconveniently than my left hand and arm. Those I carried in a sling, and I could only wear my coat like a cloak, loose over my shoulders and fastened at the neck. My hair had been caught by the fire, but not my head or face. When Herbert had been down to Hammersmith and seen his father, he came back to me at our chambers and devoted the day to attending to me. He was the kindest of nurses, and at stated times took off the bandages and steeped them in the cooling liquid that was kept ready, and put them on again with a patient tenderness that I was deeply grateful for. At first, as I lay quiet on the sofa, I found it painfully difficult, I might say impossible, to get rid of the impression of the glare of the flames, their hurry and noise, and the fierce burning smell. If I dozed for a minute, I was awakened by Miss Havisham's cries, and by her running at me with all that height of fire above her head. This pain of the mind was much harder to strive against than any bodily pain I suffered, and Herbert, seeing that, did his utmost to hold my attention engaged. Neither of us spoke of the boat, but we both thought of it. That was made apparent by our avoidance of the subject, and by our agreeing, without agreement, to make my recovery of the use of my hands a question of so many hours, not of so many weeks. My first question when I saw Herbert had been, of course, whether all was well down the river. As he replied in the affirmative with perfect confidence and cheerfulness, we did not resume the subject until the day was wearing away. But then, as Herbert changed the bandages, more by the light of the fire than by the outer light, he went back to it spontaneously. "I sat with Provis last night, Handel, 2 good hours." "Where was Clara?" "Dear little thing," said Herbert. "She was up and down with Gruff and Grim all the evening. He was perpetually pegging at the floor the moment she left his sight. I doubt if he can hold out long, though, what with the rum and pepper and rum, I should think his pegging must be nearly over." "And then you will be married, Herbert?" "How can I take care of the dear child otherwise? Lay your arm upon the back of the sofa, my dear boy, and I'll sit down here and get the bandage off so gradually that you shall not know when it comes. I was speaking of Provis. Do you know, Handel, he improves. I said to you I thought he was softened when I last saw him. So you did, and so he is. He was very communicative last night, and told me more of his life. You remember his breaking off here about some woman that he had a great trouble with. Did I hurt you?" I had started, but not under his touch. His words had given me a start. "I had forgotten that, Herbert, but I remember it now you speak of it." "Well, he went into that part of his life, and a dark, wild part it is. Shall I tell you, or will it worry you just now?" "Tell me, by all means, every word." Herbert bent forward to look at me more nearly, as if my reply had been rather more hurried or more eager than he could quite account for. "Your head is cool," he said, touching it. "Quite," said I. "Tell me what Provis said, my dear Herbert." "It seems," said Herbert, "there's a bandage off most charmingly, and now comes the cool one. Makes you shrink first, my poor dear fellow, don't it? But it will be comfortable presently. It seems that the woman was a young woman, and a jealous woman, and a revengeful woman. Revengeful, Handel, to the last degree." "To what last degree?" "Murder. Does it strike too cold on that sensitive place?" "I don't feel it. How did she murder? Whom did she murder?" "Why, the deed may not have merited quite so terrible a name," said Herbert, "but she was tried for it, and Mr. Jaggers defended her, and the reputation of that defence first made his name known to Provis. It was another and stronger woman who was the victim, and there had been a struggle in a barn. Who began it, or how fair it was, or how unfair, may be doubtful, but how it ended is certainly not doubtful, for the victim was found throttled." "Was the woman brought in guilty?" "No, she was acquitted. My poor Handel, I hurt you. It is impossible to be gentler, Herbert. Yes, what else?" "This acquitted young woman and Provis had a little child, the little child of whom Provis was exceedingly fond. On the evening of the very night when the object of her jealousy was strangled, as I tell you, the young woman presented herself before Provis for one moment, and swore that she would destroy the child which was in her possession, and he should never see it again, and then she vanished. There's the worst arm comfortably in the sling once more, and now there remains but the right hand, which is a far easier job. I can do it better by this light than by a stronger, for my hand is steadiest when I don't see the poor blistered patches too distinctly. You don't think your breathing is affected, my dear boy? You seem to breathe quickly." "Perhaps I do, Herbert. Did the woman keep her oath?" "There comes the darkest part of Provis's life. She did. That is, he says she did." "Why, of course, my dear boy," returned Herbert in a tone of surprise, and again bending forward to get a nearer look at me. "He says it all. I have no other information." "No, to be sure." "Now whether," pursued Herbert, "he had used the child's mother ill, or whether he had used the child's mother well, Provis doesn't say, but she had shared some 4 or 5 years of the wretched life he described to us at this fireside, and he seems to have felt pity for her, and forbearance towards her. Therefore, fearing he should be called upon to depose about this destroyed child, and so be the cause of her death, he hid himself, much as he grieved for the child, kept himself dark, as he says, out of the way, out of the trial, and was only vaguely talked of as a certain man called Abel, out of whom the jealousy arose. After the acquittal she disappeared, and thus he lost the child and the child's mother. I want to ask—" "A moment, my dear boy, and I have done. That evil genius, Compeyson, the worst of scoundrels among many scoundrels, knowing of his keeping out of the way at that time, and of his reasons for doing so, of course afterwards held the knowledge over his head as a means of keeping him poorer and working him harder. It was clear last night that this barbed the point of Provis's animosity." "I want to know," said I, "and particularly, Herbert, whether he told you when this happened." "Particularly? Let me remember then what he said as to that. His expression was a round score a year ago, and almost directly after I took up with Compeyson. How old were you when you came upon him in the little churchyard?" "I think in my 7th year." "Ah, it had happened some 3 or 4 years then," he said, "and you brought into his mind the little girl so tragically lost, who would have been about your age." "Herbert," said I, after a short silence, in a hurried way, "can you see me best by the light of the window or the light of the fire?" "By the firelight," answered Herbert, coming close again. "Look at me." "I do look at you, my dear boy." "Touch me." "I do touch you, my dear boy." "You are not afraid that I am in any fever, or that my head is much disordered by the incident last night?" "No, dear boy," said Herbert, after taking time to examine me. "You are rather excited, but you are quite yourself." "I know I am quite myself, and the man we have in hiding down the river is Estella's father." Chapter 50.